You're on mute, Tom. Tom, you're on mute.
Thank you, Lauren. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Okay. Good afternoon. I am Thomas Saunders, and I work on the Director of Government Affairs for Ports America, and I serve as the Vice Chair of the NAWE's board. I am just kicking it off here, and our chair, Doug Morante, was unable to. If for everyone who is on, can you please mute yourself? Okay, thank you. So Doug Morgante was unable to make it today, so I'm stepping in just to kind of kick off the call here. Thank you all for joining us and taking your time out of your busy days for this informative and first of its kind economic and legislative outlook for 2022. Today, NAWE welcomes Paul Bigman and Walter Kemses, each respected industry economists, to provide insight regarding the year ahead, including economic indicators, impacts on MTOs, and supply chain impacts. Following both Paul and Walter, we have Stephen Peranich and Dave Jansen, the government relations team with Blank Rome, who will provide much needed and in layman's terms for us who are not DC insiders, congressional analysis on priority legislation, important MTOs, and kind of give a sense what's going to be moving in the coming months that we all should be concerned about or be looking at and analyzing and potentially influencing. So I think NAWE members can expect from Dave and from Stephen to sort of some analysis on both House and Senate side bills and the process of bills moving through. And then lastly, we have our last but not least, we have our team from Becker. Omar, Clarence, and Anthony will explain how to best read between the lines in the coming year regarding midterm elections, retirements, primaries, and other critical factors that may impact the political headwinds here in Washington, D.C. So before I turn it over to Lauren Brand, the president, I'd like to share with you a few highlights from NAWE's 2021 and some of our accomplishments. But first, I'd like to thank Lauren and her team, Heather and Victoria, for all their hard work this last year. You guys, all three of you, have really done a great job for NAWE, and we really appreciate, the board appreciates everything you do, as well as all the members who participate in all of our committees and all of our task force. Really, it's important that we all work together towards advancing our industry's critical needs here in Washington, D.C. So just a few things, if I could highlight for us. We have been able to move through the last year, the second year of a COVID pandemic, and our industry has seen significant increases in cargo throughput, and there's been a much more of a lens on our industry. So we've been able to get ourselves out there in Congress and give ourselves more of a name and credibility to influence and educate congressional staffers and members of Congress and the administration on the importance of what we do every day in and out. So I think, one thing I want to highlight before I hand it over to Lauren is NAWE's impact on the infrastructure bill. It's the largest increase in federal investment in infrastructure since the 1956 Highway Act. But ports are are getting more and more funding that we had not been before, and actually there's a lot more funding out there in this bill than there ever has been for freight and multimodal infrastructure that I think now we will pay attention to much more, and we all have to understand what we can do with our public entity partners to try to apply for funding. So just in general, I'd say that the organization, its direction has been very positive. We are going to ramp up this coming year our public relations campaign to sort of get better, some more positive messaging out there. So I think we all could say that last year was despite the pandemic, we had a pretty successful advocacy year. So the board thanks all the members and the NAWE team for all their hard work. So Lauren, I'll give it back to you now.
Thank you very much, Tom. And thank you everyone who's joined us today. As always, thank you to Heather and Victoria. We're a great team. We have fun and we get it done. And at the end of last year, we took just a moment to stop and look back and say, wow, look at everything that was done in 2021. In addition to trying to provide benefits and working hard to provide benefits for members, one thing hey, Catherine, good to have you with us today. One thing that we really like to do is set a theme for the year. And the very first year that I've been with NAWE was 2020, and Victoria and I started the year together. It was just the two of us. And our theme was awareness. Let's build awareness for NAWE. In 2021, Heather joined us, and our theme for the year was trusted advisor. We worked really hard to become a trusted advisor on the Hill and known for our technical expertise and our willingness to help with solutions. This year, our theme is NAWE as a maritime thought leader. So we're elevating where we go, what we talk about, and how we do it. And that's why we're having this forecast today. We're going to look at forecast for 2022, what's hitting us in the economic world, the legislative world, and the political world. It's going to be a really good session. We have great speakers. I'd like to, and thank you for putting that up. There's our agenda today. I'd like to take just a few minutes to show you the board approved lobby strategy. So if you could put those slides up for me. And it's real quick, but this is your association's lobbying strategy for 2022. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. These are all of our members, and there we go with the table of contents. So I'm going to talk quickly about the why, the who, and the how. Next slide, please. We have had more issues hit us these last 2 years than we can ever remember. I've been doing this for 50 years and I've never seen it like this. So we need a strategic plan to achieve our goals in the coming years. And we look at long-term plans as well as quick wins. Next, please. Next slide, please. This is who is on your team. So the board in September, the board engaged, authorized engaging 2 lobbying firms and a legal firm through retainers. So today you'll be meeting our lobbyist at Becker and at Blank Rome. We also have our legal advisor at Cozen O'Connor on retainer, Jeff Vogel. And I think he's trying to call in today. I'm not sure if he was able to or not, but I know we just tasked him with doing the redlining of HR 3114 for us, so he might be too busy to do this. And then we've also engaged a PR firm, EPCO Worldwide, to do 5 op-eds for us in mainstream and political media. We're working on our very first one. And the topics for the op-eds will follow the pillars that you're going to see today. The very first op-ed, they're shopping to Wall Street Journal. Wish us luck with that. And the topic is supply chain. That's all the teaser I'll give you on that. But as members, you will see this as soon as it comes out. Next, please. This is how we're going to do this. We're going to develop champions on committees of jurisdiction in the House and Senate. We're going to enhance our relationships in the legislative and executive branches. And we're going to grow NAWE's brand as an industry thought leader. Next, please. So this is how we're going to do it. I think you have to hit a couple more buttons. It shouldn't be delaying like this. Thank you. We should see those 5 pillars. So Victoria, Heather, and I and our lobbying team looked at all the issues we have touched in the last 2 years, and we discovered we could put every issue into one of these 5 buckets. Rather than calling them our buckets, we decided to call them our pillars. And we will publish these pillars on our website, hopefully in the next month. With a couple bullets that you'll see today about what each pillar means for us, what our focus is. And then every time we do a public paper or a public letter, we will post those on the website in the appropriate bucket or pillar. Next slide. and like guidelines. This is what guides what we're going to do. And we'll do the next one. I love this picture. Climate change. And Victoria, I see you've made my slides look better. Thank you so much. Victoria does all of our branding for NAWE, and she just has a real artistic touch and makes us look much cleaner and sharper. I've had a lot of conversations lately about zero versus near zero. There's a lot of legislation pending to support zero emissions for projects, zero emissions for cargo handling equipment. But nobody's talking about near zero. And we're trying to change this zero language to include near zero. And the reason I give is I remind them when the grid shut down in Texas due to ice storms in 2020, when Hurricane Ida came up and hit multiple states and shut down the grid in those states, wildfires in California this last summer shut down the grid in California to the point that you couldn't cold iron a vessel. We had tornadoes, which are common in Florida, but not common on the port in Jacksonville, actually crumple a crane in Jacksonville in 2008. If every terminal were on the grid, every time the grid was shut down, our economy grinds to a halt. I know for the city of Houston alone, when that port shuts down, it's $1 billion a day hit to the economy. We can't afford that as a nation. We need near zero. We need to have redundancy and resiliency, and our continuity of operations plans have to include near zero. So we're getting really good talking points on this and starting to push this as a pillar. Next, please. Next, please. I know I'm speaking faster than the computers. Economies, yeah, we'll just go back one. The environment is part of climate. So we'll be discussing environmental issues. One of the things we're finding with the infrastructure projects is regulations are varying from state to state, and especially on the West Coast, changes are coming so fast. Project modifications are being required while the project is ongoing in order to comply, and that's increasing costs. We can't keep doing that. Modifying equipment is expensive. When you modify the equipment, it has a life cycle of expectancy of like 20 years. So you can't pay millions of dollars, modify the equipment, and then go pay another couple $100,000 2 years later to modify it again, and then keep doing it again and again. You want it to last the 20 years. So we've been talking about this and the cycles of changes in meetings with the federal government. Next, please. Thanks. Infrastructure is another pillar. And this includes everything between the gate and the berth, intermodal connectors, technology, and utilities. And the big issues that we're addressing are the billions of dollars of grants that were in the IIJA. And then we've got fiscal 22 budget coming, so we might get another tranche of money for the port infrastructure development as well as other programs beyond what's in IIJA. We're analyzing all of that. We're bringing it to you. We're running a grants webinar again in March. It was very popular last year. We're addressing the Buy American Act policy. The law allows for imported cargo handling equipment to be assisted through federal assistance, but the policy does not allow that. So we're trying to address that and do an education piece on that. And there's some regulations that we're seeing drafted about cargo handling equipment, not allowing it to be acquired from certain nations. We're addressing that because some of those nations are all that provide that equipment that's necessary to our economy. Next, please. I'm almost done here. Waterfront workers, we have some top issues. Without the workers, our day-to-day activities would be so much more difficult to do. Safety, training, the pandemic. These are all issues we talk about regularly on the Hill. Next, please. Security. We have a security committee that's going to be revitalized. I think it's next month. And I think Loco AI is our speaker. Joseph Zaki, I think is his last name. I know, Catherine, you can correct me, but we're excited about that presentation and helping to kick off security committee. They'll be addressing cybersecurity, which we did a lot in 21, drone usage at terminals, port security grants. Less than 50% of port security grants issued actually go for port projects. It's not right. We need to change that dynamic. Cargo handling equipment technology compromising. That's very key in Hill conversations right now. They're very concerned about it. And they're talking about proposing a replacement program, but the replacement program doesn't allow for the importation of equipment. So there's a lot of technical things that we jump into conversations on. Next, please. Thank you, Heather, for posting that. Security Committee will be February 22nd. Supply chain, we discussed this because it's in the press so much now. Issues include detention and demurrage, data collection, public relations and media coverage I've already mentioned. And with data collection, you wouldn't believe the number of proposed bills that include mandates for data collection. Like we're going to collect our way out of supply chain issues, but there's standardizations, there are things that we can contribute to, but there's questions we need to ask about data collection. I see a question about, will this presentation be shared? Yes, we'll post this presentation in the member resources section of our website, and Victoria will get that link out to everyone later. Next, please. Is this my last slide? Yes. Thank you very much. And if there's any questions for me, hold them to the end. I'll be here for the duration. I suppose I should introduce our next two speakers. We have Walter Kimses and Paul Bingham. They're both top economists. They've had a lot of articles that they've published this past year on supply chain and the issues in the industry. And they're the two that I think really understand what's happened and what's been going on. And we invited them to speak. And I'm just going to turn it over to them. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Lauren. And Walter, hey, I can see your video, so hopefully your audio is working too. It looks like you're still on mute on the video screen. Can we hear you, Walter?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Okay, great. All right, well, Walter and I have planned a tag team here. This is an update on the forecast outlook for the economy, and then we'll get into trade-specific issues that affect the demand for the port's activity as part of what we're going to cover. You know, this is a moving target through the pandemic. My economist colleagues on our macro forecasting side and industry and so forth have been updating forecasts more frequently than they ever have before. And so, you know, this perspective today is a snapshot. Obviously, if we were to talk to you like at TPM in March or, you know, later in the year, we'd probably have a further update. But this is current as of right now, you know, based on the indicators that we've got and the forecasts respectively that Walter and my company have covering the industry and the globe. So I'm going to start with the top level, and then Walter's going to jump in and contribute his perspectives as well as we go. I've got an outline that we're working from jointly, and I'm going to kick it off, and then we'll just go through this. And we encourage questions either in the chat box, and we look at them, and then before the end. We've got until I think 2 o'clock to get through this, so we have a little bit of time, and hopefully we'll have some time to answer your questions. Our company's top line perspective on the global economy is a slowing of growth compared to last year. And this is going to get reflected right down into trade volume activity for the ports. Last year, we had 5.5% growth globally, and we're forecasting a reduction to 4.2%. Far from recession, still very strong growth from a global perspective. But a lot of details beneath that in terms of which countries, which sectors, which commodities, and so forth, we're going to see growth from. For the United States, we're forecasting that the growth rate also slows. Growth last year also of about 5.5%, but slowing this year. Our latest forecast actually now is 4.1% GDP growth. From a pre-pandemic perspective, that's still remarkably strong economic growth, but it's still slower growth than we saw last year. And within that, there's a composition shift away from goods more towards services by the time we get to the end of the year. And I'm going to come back to that. And then let me touch on, you know, very quickly where we are with Omicron. You know, we've been chasing all the pandemic waves in terms of their impacts on the economy. Omicron, I think, caught us a little bit by surprise in terms of how big of an impact it's had in the short run. this temporary bite out of demand, especially reductions in services spending, restaurants and entertainment and so forth, that fell a little bit further in the last few weeks than we had been even anticipating. And specifically, you've had these supply disruptions where the workforce has actually had quite a hit to it, as you've had workers that were homesick or quarantining because of exposure or whatever, and that's having an impact ultimately for trade demand, because there's some reversion to the pandemic style spending on goods and reduction in spending on services, which is going to elongate the timing of what we've been predicting is a reversion towards more typical patterns of mixes of spending on services versus goods consumption that we had before the pandemic. And that directly translates into the goods demand, that translates to the port cargo demand forecast. And this impact of Omicron is not just the United States. Obviously, it affects our trade partners, and very significantly, that can affect, say, for example, China, where they still have this low tolerance policy affecting factory production, port operations, and the operations of supply chains. So it's not just a demand impact from the United States; it's also affecting supply chains and the suppliers, and even some of the demand for U.S. exports, in the short run. We don't anticipate this was going to last a long time, but it's certainly having an impact that's going to be there by the time we get to the end of the year in the final numbers. Walter, do you want to jump in on that? Walter, I can't hear you. Walter, I still can't hear you. No, we're not hearing you. Do we have him muted for some reason? Nah, we're still not hearing you, Walter. You want to dial in?
One moment, we'll try to unmute him.
Okay.
Walter, are you able to try again to unmute your mic? Okay, just continue talking. Your mic is on.
All right, we'll get you on here. Walter, we're still not getting you. All right. Well, tell you what, Walter, I'm gonna keep talking for a little bit, and then we'll get you connected. I know we're gonna do this somehow, so we can hear you. Let me jump ahead a little bit to talk about the U.S. retail sales and spending. Ultimately, the trade situation affecting the ports has been most importantly driven by household and business spending during the pandemic, which we all know, jumped up substantially in 2020. And really was unrelenting through 2021 for a number of reasons. If we look at the most recent numbers, though, we saw a little bit of a pullback in December, and that trade demand actually had been accelerated a little bit earlier in the holiday shopping season, likely due to the supply chain disruption publicity, not just at the ports, but sort of generically. And also, we've seen now some impacts of the inflation, high prices of goods and services hitting some consumer sentiment, and for some demographics of consumers, their spending patterns. We've also seen some of the supply chain disruptions that have also affected some of that consumption patterns, where certain goods are not available in adequate numbers. For example, automobiles, where the chip supply shortage is forecast to continue well into this year, and therefore affecting the associated supply chains and associated trade demand. Let's see if we've got Walter back on. Okay, there goes Walter. Well, let me keep going here. The impact of the reduction in the consumer spending, though, is not something that we anticipate will significantly reduce the trade demand in the first half of 2022 in any case, because there is still a situation where we have really excess savings on the part of households, and wealth effects from the high asset prices of the stock market, despite even the recent correction in asset prices, and the low household debt that supports a forecast for us of the personal consumer expenditure growth of still 3.6%. In 2022, which is still lower than we saw in 2021, but still meaning that we're still in an expansionary mode overall in terms of consumption expenditures. The catch is how much of that expenditure on households is going to go towards goods. And we actually are forecasting a decline of the personal expenditures on durable goods of 1.1% in 2022, and contrast that to our forecast of expenditures on services, even if you take out housing and healthcare, things like entertainment and personal travel, up 7.7%. So we are forecasting by the end of the year, there will be this adjustment where there will be a shift away from the consumption of goods, especially those imported durable goods, and more towards services by the time we get to the end of the year. And that affects ultimately our trade forecast. Walter,
Paul?
can we hear you now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. All right.
Oh, it's a miracle.
Yeah.
Add something to Microsoft's manual on how not to use Teams. So let me just kind of circle back and catch up with you. I worked on Wall Street for a number of years before I woke up and realized it was so much more fun in transportation. And but one of the first things they teach when you walk in the door is, the first one is the market is always right. And the second one is do not fight the Fed. So if the Fed is talking about slowing the economy down and the market starts to wobble a bit because they're hoping there won't be a policy error by the Fed, they don't do what Bernanke did so many years ago and just, throw us into the incinerator. The market starts pricing that risk, and it's exactly what Paul was saying, but basically you can't fight the Fed here. Things have to slow. And when it comes to growth, I have my own numbers, but when you look around and you participate in some Fed conferences and other things, plus or minus 4.3%, as Paul said, makes a lot of sense. You've got too many potential arguments for why growth could be higher, and too many potential arguments for why growth could be lower. This isn't the typical economist going, on the one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand. They're not doing that. They're just, there are things that you cannot possibly, forecast. So back at the beginning of the pandemic, I was asked to help some folks out with their budgeting for the next fiscal year that started at the beginning of July. And they wanted to put in horribly negative numbers. And so we had to walk them off the ledge and say, look, when you forecast something is going to be really bad, you're not the only one who can see that. Other people can too. There will be a reaction, and the reaction will blunt all of the drop. And so I unsuccessfully argued to get people to go to 0% growth, but no, they said negative whatever percent. And of course, we were all wrong. If you look at port volumes, which is where I was focused, they were up 20%, at least for some ports, not for everybody. And so, we don't have that much resolve. Paul's point has to be listened to very carefully. The Omicron impact is, nobody anticipated it'd be as harsh, and it could be over so much faster than any of us are thinking. So, I like the slower growth rate, but still above trend level. It makes sense to me because the balance of risks seem to be more on growth coming in above the long-term trend. Paul, did you get to inflation yet? Because I had to jump off. I wanted to say a few things on the inflation.
I only began to touch on it, so go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So before we go into some of the drivers of this, and there are plenty of those, one thing to bear in mind is economists talk about relative price movements and absolute price movements. And when we say inflation, what we mean is a general rise in the level of prices. But we do an analysis. We want to know whether some prices are rising faster than others, because once things get righted in the area where the prices spiked up a lot, they could come back down, and then your relative prices return to normal. In case in point is the cost of transportation. But let me come back to that in a minute. You were going to say something about inflation too, Paul. So why don't we, kind of drill
Yeah,
into all the pieces.
So for 2021, we've had this, historic almost 40-year consumer price inflation jump, especially in the second half and in the fourth quarter, where for the year, up to 7% CPI inflation. And there's some of that which is going to linger into 2022, despite, Walter's absolutely right. The Federal Reserve is moving aggressively now, away from just focusing on employment and moving towards their other dual target of dealing with inflation. And, we're running way ahead of their 2% target. So they're taking action and the markets will react and we're going to see a reduction in inflation, partly as a consequence of that. But there were already some reductions that were built in, as Walter was saying, on the commodity side, like some of the factors that drove that incredibly high inflation that we've seen recently. Like the increase in valuation and prices of used motor vehicles. Those are double-digit growth rates where people are selling vehicles for more than they paid for them. That's a reaction to the chip shortage affecting production of new motor vehicles. That doesn't get solved overnight, but our autos industry our group is forecasting that the industry will recover some by the end of 2022, and that will come down, and those prices can actually fall on the used vehicle side back more towards the trend. Not immediately, but contributing for the year a reduction in inflation. There's other factors in food and energy, where we may not see the prices stay as high as they are. On the other hand, as Walter said, there's enormous risk, say, for example, in the energy markets, both up and down from geopolitical events that could happen. But currently our forecast for the year is now actually, and Walter, this is just updated, 4.2% consumer price index inflation for the year. So by historical standards of the last couple decades, that's still very high inflation, but it's a reduction and trending downwards from where we were towards the end of last year. And that's likely, to continue beyond that. We don't have a forecast that says we have built in this, we're not returning to the 1970s or the early 80s in terms of inflation expectations or our forecast for top line inflation, not negating the fact that there's some elements that contribute to inflation at a specific commodity level or on the wage side, where wages tend to be sticky on the downside for a lot of hourly employees in any case. And those are likely to contribute to inflation that does run above 2% for quite a while, which is higher than we've been used to for the last decade, despite the Fed's attempt to keep it near 2%. So Walter, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah. And if you look at the bond markets, and let's put a caveat here, the Federal Reserve has been buying a lot of government bonds. So there is some market interference. But nonetheless, I still think the pricing reflects market sentiment. And what you watch in the markets is the tip spread. That's the Treasury inflation protected yield minus the yield on the not inflation indexed bond. So the government issues two kinds of bonds. One of them has a coupon that adjusts with the inflation rate. The other one does not. It is what they said it was going to be. And if there's a lot of inflation and your coupon payment isn't worth as much, that's your risk. And so we look at the difference between those two yields to back out what the market is saying about inflation. And the 10-year not protected yield is 2.5 percentage points above that of the inflation protected. What that means is over the next 10 years, the bond market is saying inflation is going to average 2.5%. Now, before this, it was a little bit all over the place, but the bond market for the longest time had been pricing in inflation below 2%. So there is some recognition that inflation is going to be higher, but nothing like the 70s. It's exactly what Paul said. So we have way too much money, way too many investors behind the view that we're expressing here to you today.
Yeah, Walter, let me add one more perspective on inflation, which is there has been some commentary that the federal spending programs like the Infrastructure Jobs Act or let alone the Build Back Better would be contributing or adding to the inflationary pressure, the classic crowding out of government spending and competition with the private sector. The timing of the Infrastructure and Job Act spending is actually not so much in 2022. It's passed now, but some of that still has to be actually appropriated. And there's a lot of that infrastructure spending that can't wrap up instantly. You've got to go to design before you can do the construction in some cases, for example, so that the majority of that spending, plays plays out over a period of time. It's not all that it happens, before the midterm elections in November, even if some politicians would like that. And similarly, we don't have, and this is an important caveat, all of the forecasts that we've produced right now don't include the Build Back Better additional fiscal spending by the federal government passing and actually happening. We are skeptics that that can happen, as has been proposed as sort of an alternative scenario that we would have to consider if that were to actually find a way to pass. So that excludes that. It does include the infrastructure spending, however. So that has some impacts on inflation in certain commodity markets, like eventually for some construction materials, but not very much in 2022 in any case. So I think that's another relevant piece to it. And one other factor on inflation that sort of also ties to the trade.
Paul,
Yeah, go ahead, Walter.
Just to make a clear point here, the press headlines can be very confusing, but there is a big difference between a bill passing, a project being approved, like Port X is getting $10 to fix their air draft issue. The announcement comes, they've agreed to it, but but being shovel ready and being paycheck ready are two different things. So it's exactly what Paul said. The two of us have been involved in too many of these projects, and we know, and probably a lot of you guys know, that there is a serious lag. So I just want to really reinforce the important point Paul made. The reason being is that the economy slows down a lot in the second half of the year. You will probably by this time next year see some lift from the infrastructure spending, but not that fast.
Yeah.
Sorry, well, you were going to make your second point on inflation.
Yeah, no, actually, that's a very important to understand the context of that bill. It's incredibly positive for the economy and the investment and so forth. But in terms of the near term, or this part of 2022, you have to wait quite a while for that to see really an impact. Now, one other factor that affects the price inflation we've seen has been the supply demand imbalance, and one of the reflections of that have been the very low inventory. So you've had situations where in certain commodity markets, especially, prices are high because there's a shortage of actual supply. And there is some continuation of that, into 2022. But some of that actually, we've already started to see signs at the end of last year of the inventory rebuilding that's sort of been pent up demand. There's been a pent up desire on the part of a lot of retailers and other businesses to rebuild inventories. And through 2021, they were playing catch up and couldn't. They really weren't able to restore their inventory to sales ratios anywhere near where they would want to have them historically, let alone to deal with potential buffers against shocks like they've had to endure the last 2 years. So there has been this pent up demand to build inventory separately from the consumer demand or the business demand for goods for final consumption. And that means that there's a tailwind behind some of the goods demand on the import side for inventory rebuilding. However, that's already started. Some of that we've already now seen in 2021. So the momentum behind that is going to carry a little bit less far into the future and probably play out, earlier through 2022. And it really depends, obviously, on the sector. Like the auto industry probably has longer to go to catch up than some of the other retail goods sectors in terms of catching up on inventories. But that's another factor that also affects then perceptions of prices and inflation based on adequate supply for some of those goods. And then, Walter, I think you've got some comments on some goods that are still coming through the inventory pipeline that were intended to be here last year and weren't.
Yeah, exactly. So some of the 2021 goods that didn't show up, they are now ready for 2022. And so if you've read the Wall Street Journal, they picked up on a point that, containers full of Halloween stuff just arrived last week. Great. So what are you going to do with it? Well, you're not going to burn it. You're not going to throw it out. You're going to put it someplace, probably a newspaper warehouse, since they don't need as much of that room. They don't have the same circulation. Stick it in there. And this isn't too far from the truth, because I've been helping people do that, as well as we've got some exporters with a lot extra room. And we'll talk about exports in a minute. But they had a lot extra room at their warehouses near the ports, so they rented it out to the importers who didn't have enough room. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. But one important thing you need to realize, Paul and I know this, and oftentimes, we forget to remind people, inventory isn't inventory until the company who's receiving it from their foreign source declares it as now being in their premises. So a growing practice over the last 10 years was not to pay on the goods until they left your warehouse. So they got off the ship, they got into your warehouse. It's still not yours, but the minute you ship it to one of the stores or to an e-commerce fulfillment center, then you declare it your inventory. So we know the data, the macro data is a little bit wonky because right now it says the retailer's inventories are at 2016 levels. Oh, come on, no way. All right, sorry. Yeah, we know better than that, but it's definitely not where the inventories need to be. And the proof is in the pudding, right? Walk into any supermarket and see which one has more than 90% of the shelves full. If you can find one, send us a picture, please. Anyways, just pass it back to you there, Paul.
All right. Well, so let's turn to trade here. I mean, there's a couple of factors we want to cover in terms of the modal dimensions and the geographic dimensions of trade. But let me start with our top line view. And this is from the macroeconomist view of trade is in dollar terms, not TEUs or tonnages or even, you know, a particular mode of transport. But if we look at it, that biggest picture view, our forecast is a decline and a substantial decline in imports in 2022 versus 2021. This tremendously strong year we had of double-digit growth, even in value terms, let alone TEU terms, for U.S. imports. We've estimated that the final numbers coming in will show in value terms over 13% growth in U.S. imports in 2021, and our forecast for 2022 is still growth, but that growth slowing substantially to 4.4%. So partly a reaction to what Walter just described, where there's some inventory that came in that was ordered and was maybe even some of it was counted in 2021 that's going to be here in 2022 and won't need to be reordered and re-imported in 2022 to serve those anticipated demands later this year. There's also this reduction in goods consumption that I mentioned specifically earlier, that this actual drop in the consumer expenditures on durable goods that's going to filter right back through to the factories in Asia and elsewhere in terms of our supplier countries overseas. And that's going to translate into slower growth in the aggregate in the volumes being demanded through the ports. So the pressure in terms of the growth is going to be reduced, but it's still growth compared to last year. So it's not as if we're actually going to have a reduction in volume demanded that caused such congestion in 2021. And that means the pressure is actually still there on the ports by and large to handle this volume. And let me add to that, on the export side, where we saw growth of only 3.7% in 2021 due to a host of factors, including weakness amongst some of our foreign trade partners, but also problems with the supply chains and access at efficient costs or even equipment availability for exporters to be able to achieve export sales in 2021. We're forecasting 5.5% growth in value terms of exports in 2022. So actually it's not really a turnaround, but an expansion of U.S. export success and growth in 2022 compared to last year, but still by no means anywhere near as strong as imports have been, even though we see really this reversal towards an export, especially towards the second half of the year, where exports are growing fairly strongly into that growing world economy. Walter, let me let you follow in to that.
Yeah. So yeah, by the way, it's kind of rare that economists agree across the board, but mostly it's because a lot of the room for disagreement isn't rational. They're just things that we can't predict. If after Omicron we get the epsilon variant, right, or the whatever, the 5 variant, we don't know that. So when you start taking away a lot of the uncertain things and you look at the certain things, it's a lot easier to come to agreement. But we are watching one thing, and we've debated this quite a bit. But I like looking at it from the port's point of view. I watch what percentage of the imports are housing related, people buying a new house or new housing, starts. The new housing start data, the last couple of months, we have been over at an annual rate of 1.6 million, starts. That's significant because the last time before these last few years that we hit that was briefly for a month in December of 2019. And before that, not since 2006, when we were well over 2 million starts a year. The reason I bring that up about 2006 is some of our favorite ports, located in Southern California, their volumes peaked and started to decline before the rest of the industry. And when you take apart the volumes, what was inside those containers coming into the ports, it was housing related stuff, furniture, appliances, tiles, flooring, wall stuff, drywall. I mean, and since that housing, business was just booming, China reacted very quickly. So we got a lot of stuff from China. It naturally came in through LA, Long Beach, some through Seattle, Tacoma, etc. But those guys were very, very concentrated on it. And when the housing, boom started to bust, it took down the port volumes with it. So looking around the country now, more ports seem to be more geared towards the housing market. So that's something I've been fighting over and discussing with other analysts. And it's a critical thing to know about housing because, maybe we're going to stop buying 6, 7, or 8 fishing rods because we're at home bored and we can't go anywhere. That kind of like crazy discretionary spending might be over, but you do have pent up demand from the children of the baby boomers who graduated in the latter half of the 2000s and didn't have the job. And so they've been economically impacted since 2016 when things went well for several years. A lot of them, along with probably some government money, are feeling pretty encouraged to go either buy a house or build a house. But either way, the housing market is very strong, and it's hard to argue that it's going to go away. Even if the Fed does the 3 hikes they're talking about, the Fed funds rate is still going to be below where it was in 2019. So there are plenty of structural things in the economy that argue exactly for what Paul just summarized for you. I'll stop there, Paul. We'll get to the exports.
Yeah, Walter, let me add a little bit on the housing market. We do have a slight, and let me emphasize, slight slowdown in the housing market in 2022 forecast compared to 2021. It's like 100 basis points compared to what it was last year. And partly as a reaction to the interest rate policies of the Fed by the end of the year, and also some continuation of the supply chain issues that have constrained some of the new home construction and, well, even some of the repair work that have affected housing markets this year, plus some of the price inflation factors affecting some of the consumers in the housing markets. So we don't have it in a situation where it's continuing to accelerate or actually, prices going up even further in the housing market. But we still have a strong housing market in 2022, but it's clearly decelerating, I guess is the word we would put on it. So that some of that pressure at the margin is coming off a little bit, especially as we get towards the end of the year. But by no means would we characterize that as a weak housing market. It's one that just is, we're just past the peak. So that does affect trade, like you said, the furniture and fixtures and all sorts of other related household furnishings that get sold and brought in, especially for containerized trade, are so important on the import side.
Right. And just to give everybody in here, because Paul and I know this, but in case you don't know it, the long-term average going back 60 years for new home starts is about 1.2 million starts a year. So if you're at 1.6 and you go down 1%, you're still above the average, the long-term average. So, I just want to give you a couple of numbers to kind of hang your hat on. But do we want to hit exports before we run out of time?
Yeah. So let me, my last comment on that. The number actually for us is 1.48 on the housing starts for 2022. So you're right. We're off of that peak, but just still historically above trend. Now on the export side, we have a weakening of some of our trade partner country economies in 2022 compared to 2021. But as I said at the very start, that's still very strong growth in the aggregate. We're moving from, just under 6% growth for the global economy down to 4%. Before the pandemic, we were talking about growth over 2%, or like 2 to 3% globally was pretty strong. So we're still in a situation where we've got fairly strong foreign demand. It depends on the sector and it depends on the country. China is actually forecast to see, quite a more substantial slowdown, but still growing in 2023 2022, and is some downside risk there, not just from Omicron and their low tolerance for the COVID outbreaks, but also they've got inflated housing markets. They've got some other structural problems that are coming from policy issues where they're cracking down on the tech sector. We could go on and on about some potential risk problems, not to mention the geopolitical ones around Taiwan or other factors that could affect U.S. positions and relations. Not only with countries like Russia that we're hearing so much about right now, but even with China. And we're not clear, clearly yet what's going to happen, but we're pretty sure that until the Olympics are over, the Chinese aren't going to make any really major policy moves, but we're not so sure after that what we're going to see. And obviously, as we saw under the Trump administration, federal policy can affect trade demand and trade volume directly as they're observed through the imposition or the removal of tariffs. And right now, our forecast on the export side still shows that our exports are being hit by retaliatory tariffs from some countries like China because the U.S. isn't moving off of our import tariffs that were imposed under the Trump administration, and they're still being held out as levers for other foreign policy objectives and aims of the U.S. government. And that's an important assumption that we carry forward for our forecast that, could be subject to change in a different political environment, either up or down in terms of what the government might choose to do, just like we were focused on back in 2018 and 2019 under the Trump administration when we saw those, what some people called the trade wars, affecting trade through the ports. That's still in the background apart from the pandemic and hasn't gone away as an issue that could matter. One other factor I'll identify related to the pandemic, however, is the source supply shifts that are underway. And those are not just the U.S. companies that are onshoring. It includes changing distribution networks so that you're supplying from other countries. It might just be a shift from, say, North Asia to South Asia. But clearly there's some changes underway, and those like infrastructure take time. So the redesign of those supply chains affects the potential for both U.S. imports and exports, and specifically for the maritime ports, it affects which trade share is going to move on the water versus what might move over the borders with Canada and Mexico. And we certainly are forecasting under the USMCA being in force right now, some advantages going towards some nearshoring production in Mexico, which then moves some component movement and trade across the border, and maybe not on the maritime mode of transport through U.S. ports. So that's another backdrop factor that we have in our forecast. Walter?
Yeah. So a couple of things to mention too. It's not just so much that the rest of the world economies were weak. They were. There's no argument about it. The charts all tell you that. But by the same token, domestic demand for things has been very strong.
Right.
So I do a lot of work in the resin area these days, helping companies build supply chains domestically, internationally. And we went to talk to some of the resin packagers, and they said they're not doing much business. And it's not because there isn't demand, decent demand from abroad. It's just that the demand in the U.S. went through the roof. And so domestically, you can deliver these resins a lot cheaper than when you ship things abroad. And since the domestic buyers were paying premiums over the foreign guys, the profit margins were so huge that all of the resin producers wanted to just sell it domestically rather than export. But eventually the dollar turns around, things start to slow. We raise our interest rates, GDP slows down, and the other parts of the world, particularly developed markets, pick up some steam, and then you see the pickup in exports. But as Paul said, the time horizon is a little lengthy here. But the one thing we are seeing is the return of long-term planning. I've had quite a few people ask me to join teams that are helping large companies or in transportation or manufacturing resume their supply chain, reconfiguring. And so it always starts with a short-term and a long-term forecast. And the number of people who are asking for that and want to debate it and trying to set up a new strategy team has been increasing in the last few months. So, what that tells me and Paul is that, this argument that GDP growth is going to slow down a bit, we're going to see some stabilization. We're probably not going to see the same helter-skelter, where can I get a container into the U.S.? In fact, I think what we're going to see is a contraction in overall freight volumes because things that were going in odd ways to locations. And what I mean by odd is not the cheapest or not the way it has historically, but you had to adapt. Things going to the West Coast from, say, the Mediterranean by ship, you couldn't get the stuff into the West Coast. So what did you do? Put it into an East Coast port, stuck it on rail, and railed it over. Well, this stuff starts to slow down. You're going to see some rail volumes decline. You're going to see some truck volumes decline, both, full load, less than truckload. And I would expect to hear company executives talk about, well, we've never really had a decline in transportation volumes without there being an economic recession. And they said the same thing in 2016, and it was wrong. It was just simply the correction to freight patterns after the ILWU signed their contract. So amongst the list of the uncertain things, and Paul and I have debated this quite a bit, is how would a delay to getting a new contract between the terminal operators and the ILWU impact the outlook? And we came up with too many scenarios, but we're happy to debate that with you. Sorry, Paul,
I'm looking at the clock here, Walter. We've only got a few minutes. I saw that one question in the chat box. I think we did talk about the source supply shifts a little bit. I could add just a little bit more to that I think it's not just the U.S. manufacturers and retailers that are reconfiguring supply chains. That's going on in Western Europe. It's going on elsewhere in the world. And that some of that's going to be reflected ultimately then indirectly in some of the trade patterns. So if a European manufacturer moves some manufacturing, say, from Asia to Eastern Europe, that may affect ultimately some transatlantic trade versus, say, trans-Pacific trade for the U.S. too. So I don't know. Lauren, we got just 2 minutes. Is there anything else you'd like either of us to address?
Thank you. This has been dynamite. You have been feeding us from fire hoses. Thank you
Okay.
both. The energy is palpable. And I think it's you delivered more than we expected. So I really appreciate it. I don't see any other questions in the chat box. Heather, Victoria, do you have any other questions that are coming into you?
Can I throw in a little something? Paul noted that we are seeing a shift away from China. A lot of that is also because the working age population there has been declining for 5 years, right? So they're getting priced out just like the rest of us did. Japan, Europe, America, whatever. The trade policies do impact that. Looking forward, I think the arguments that we've heard for reshoring, et cetera, are a little exaggerated. And also they're applied blanket across corporate America. Big global companies in the United States like Nike, I hate to call somebody out, but they serve the global consumer market. And if you want to sell to Asia, the largest part of the world middle class, you're going to have to produce in Asia, and your overflow can be sold in the dinky little United States market of only 300 million. Okay, so there is some of that that's going on. I can see the smaller companies that only produce in China for production in the US begin to shift and consider trying to manufacture back in the US. No problem with that, but I can't see global companies doing that. And Paul, you get the last word. I just was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, or are we still on the same page on this?
Yeah, I'm going to say, I would wrap it up by saying globalization is not going away. It's going to, even after the pandemic, it's going to continue to evolve, and trade is still going to be, absolutely critical to facilitating that. And the demand for trade, we're not going to see the growth rates we saw in 2021, but we are still going to see growth in trade over the long term, with globalization evolving, not going away.
Thank you both. We do have a question. Mark Johnson raised his hand. So there's 2 ways to ask questions. Put in the chat box or raise your hand. Mark?
I raised my hand. Well, Walter, thank
Yes.
you. And also, Paul, thank you for your comments. Let's hope that there is a contract that's agreed to in July. It's the last thing that anybody really should want, particularly under the current circumstances.
Right.
Walter, I've got a question for you. Maybe Paul wants to chime in too. I walked into my local giant food store a week ago. There were empty shelves galore of basic staple items, eggs, milk, cheeses, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. If I understood your comments correctly, you were attributing the shortage of goods to the lack of inventory. Did I understand that correct?
Well, yeah, it depends on the good in general. I would say it is because of the lack of inventory. When I look at companies, what their strategy has been is, I can't make 27 varieties of stuff. I used to do that to keep the little guys from penetrating my market, but I can't control my supply chain. So I'm going to go to my 5 best sellers and forget the other 22. I'm a victim of that. I like the other 22 more than the core products, for crackers, etc. So you do have that going on. But I would say the last couple of weeks is just simply the excessively high rate of absenteeism at companies. Just, people, all these conferences or meetings I was supposed to have all gone away. And from 2 weeks ago to 2 weeks from now, the only time I will be out in public is a dinner tonight. Outside of that, everything else has been moved to virtual. It's all been taken out, and until this wave is over. Unfortunately, if you're a transportation service provider or if you are a retailer, you're stuck with staff that won't show up. I live in Savannah, and I went to Kroger the other day and I took pictures. I've never seen a store 95% empty, other than when somebody says, hurricane or snowstorm, you get the panic buying. This wasn't panic buying. Nobody's panic buying. They're like, damn, where am I going to get my Stouffer's, fettuccine now, or my frozen food? But that's the spirit in which that's in. I don't know what Paul thinks, but I think in a couple of weeks, this could easily be over as we roll off the spike in cases. Paul, what you're hearing or looking at.
Yeah, our company's monitoring shows that current indicators they have of, how much of the economy is shut down or who's reporting that they're not at work, the hours worked and so forth. Those numbers have just come off their peak from Omicron, but we're early in the recovery, if you will, from Omicron. This wave probably plays out through February. We're not the doctors that figure that out or the pathologists, but we certainly can look at what happened in the past waves. And so we're assuming that this does play out and we get to recovery by summertime or even in the spring. And we're not forecasting another wave, but as you said, who knows? If there's another wave later this year, then we'll readjust our forecast if something else happens with another variant.
Thank you both. Will you be able to stay with us for another hour? So at the end, we'll have a Q&A and someone may have questions for you. And if you can't, I totally understand. I know you're both busy.
I've got to run off to another call for about a half an hour, but I can come back.
Yeah, and if you don't mind me multitasking for a short bit, yeah, I definitely want to stay on and hear what the folks have to say.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right.
I'd like to turn this over now to Stephen Peranich and Dave Jansen. They have been with us since I first started in early 2020, and they do great support for our legislative committee. I see we have our legislative committee chair and vice chair on the call with us today, Andrew Sinclair and Cam Spencer. But Victoria or Heather, will you put up the slides? And I turn it over now to Stephen and David.
To thank you, Lauren, for the wonderful introduction.
Stephen, I heard a few words and okay, now I see you. So, but you're muted. Okay, I think we're all set now. Thank you.
Okay, there we are. Well, hello, everyone. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. We're part, as Lauren said, of the NAWE legislative and lobbying team. And I'm Stephen Peranich, and my colleague Dave Jansen is here with me. We're going to take you through our slide presentation and hopefully have some time for some good questions. Anyway, just want to start with the 2022 legislative forecast. This is sort of the first slide, the brief overview here. The second session of the 117th Congress. We expect a limited legislative agenda, a wrap up of unfinished business from 2021, is one of the priority things that need to be addressed by Congress. Also, passage of must-pass legislative items, which we'll get into in a subsequent slide in 2022. And then, of course, there's some other possible legislation. However, there are factors that are limiting Congress's 2022 agenda, and hyper-partisan environment in Congress, shocker there, narrow Democratic majorities in the House and Senate, and the upcoming 2022 congressional midterm elections, which will impact the legislative schedule, meaning few legislative business days and Congress adjourning, at the end of, I guess, Labor Day, and trying to go back and campaign in what expects to be a very furious campaign environment. And of course, the folks, our colleagues here from Becker will the next presentation will get into that in greater detail. Dave?
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. Just looking at the unfinished and the must-pass business that we can anticipate the Congress having to deal with in the second session. I mean, the biggest, looming unfinished business is the fiscal year 2022 appropriations bills. Congress was unable to reach agreement at the end of the 2021 fiscal year, and the government's been operating under a couple of continuing resolutions, or CRs. The latest, which is due to expire on February 18th. So aside from just the usual need for and the benefit of the Congress concluding its work on appropriations bills to provide for the funding for the government, it's even more important this year because a substantial portion of the funding that was approved in the infrastructure bill requires the FY22 appropriations to be complete. I mean, if the government is operating under the CR, that means that some of these accounts that were plussed up or new programs that were authorized under those provisions, they can't go forward. And in addition, there was also money put into that legislation so that the government could hire on new contractors to get a lot of this money out the door. So this will be something that the Congress is going to have to turn its immediate attention to, and we will be monitoring the situation closely. Now, turning to must-pass business, not surprisingly, the fiscal year 2023 appropriations is going to quickly, come up and will likely be directly influenced by, what happens with the FY22 appropriations bills. This is something that, again, a lot of the business has been, pushed to the right, but this is where, as Stephen mentioned, because of the compressed congressional calendar for this session, a lot of this work is all going to happen in the first 5 to 6 months of 2022. So when the appropriators come back, if they are successful or not in clearing out on the 2022 appropriations, they're going to have to immediately pivot and start working on the 23 appropriations. It will be interesting to see whether or not there's an additional push by the Biden administration for an additional COVID-19 supplemental appropriation to provide additional money, because much of the money that was provided in the last 2 supplemental appropriations bills, a lot of that has expired, and there is interest though in trying to get more money out the door. The last item, which it is nice to kind of report that the Congress can get its work done, the National Defense Authorization Act for FY22 was approved on December 27th and enacted. So this does clear the deck for the Armed Services Committees in both the House and Senate to begin work on the FY23. This bill is important because, particularly over the past 2 or 3 cycles, the Maritime Administration authorization, which is traditionally Title 35 of the NDAA, has become a vehicle for several different maritime-related riders. And in particular for NAWE members, the Port Infrastructure Development Program was authorized under that title. And we can expect probably to see additional amendments in the upcoming NDAA, for that program. And that will be something that we'll continue to monitor. Stephen?
All right, next slide. Okay. In the legislative forecast, there will be some Biden administration priorities. One that is not on this list, that before I forget, and I wanted to mention, is now there's a recent announcement that today that Justice Stephen Breyer on the Supreme Court has announced that he will retire. So this, while Democratic majorities exist in very narrow ones in both chambers, or at least in the Senate, which has a role in confirmation, will be that will be a priority, is to find another one would expect liberal or progressive philosophy justice for the Supreme Court. So in a very crowded legislative time frame, with few days and some very priority issues, that's just going to be another thing unanticipated thrown into the breach here. So the Senate will be very focused on that. In addition to that, the other Biden administration priority that the economists spoke briefly about in their presentation is Build Back Better. As everyone knows, that sort of crashed and burned with Senators Manchin and Sinema not being able to support it. And there will be an effort, it looks like, to potentially break that bill into smaller packages, very likely still to be run through budget reconciliation, at least some elements. Some other pieces may be brought up as more messaging items to try to make the, in terms of the upcoming elections, some, votes that Democrats would want to have, and to try to put their Republican colleagues who are up for re-election on the spot. So some may be more messaging, but there will be an effort and through budget reconciliation probably to run some of those through. What's important about this generally, there are some provisions in Build Back Better of importance to NAWE and its members, and specifically their dollars for port electrification and other climate and resiliency efforts, among others, that we flagged in previous reports to the legislative committee. Anyway, there are other, of course, Biden and congressional Dem priorities. Again, not to get into the next group's presentation, but that while the Democrats maintain their very narrow majorities, that they're going to be attempting to bring up issues while they control the gavels in the chambers to try to move issues that are important to them forward. One of which has been very much in the forefront here in the new year is voting rights, and that went down, and there's probably an effort to try to come up with some elements of that might get passed in advance of the midterms.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And just moving on to maritime-related legislation that we anticipate the House and Senate acting on early in the second session, include both the Water Resources Development Act and another Coast Guard Authorization Act. Both of these bills generally are written for 2-year periods. And, in the House, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has jurisdiction over both. And in the Senate, the Water Resources Development Act, or WRDA, is under the jurisdiction of the Senate and Environment and Public Works Committee. and the Coast Guard Authorization Act is under the jurisdiction of the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. Just turning quickly to the Word of Bill, the process is already far along in moving that legislation forward. Both TNI and EPW have had oversight hearings. They're, at least in the Senate, the due date for member requests has since passed, but in the House, the due date is February 25th for member priorities and projects. And then we anticipate both committees introducing and moving legislation in the springtime, hopefully to clear it, through each chamber before the summer recess. And as regarding the Coast Guard authorization, again, this is a 2-year bill, and it is something that the schedule is behind. I mean, normally, particularly House TNI, they've introduced and reported out a Coast Guard authorization in the first session. All of the work that the Congress was doing in the first session kind of pushed TNI and their schedule and ability to handle other bills, far to the right. So they're going to be, kind of working behind the curve here to get caught up. But it's our understanding with the Coast Guard Act that in both the House and Senate that the committees are looking to get bills introduced either late February or early March, and then to have those bills considered and marked up in committee this spring. One factor which I think is really important and gives hope that the Congress again will be able to act on these bills, which generally have always garnished broad bipartisan support, is that the chairman of the House TNI committee, Peter DeFazio from Oregon, is retiring. And it is something that just knowing Chairman DeFazio, I'm sure that he is not going to want to have 2 bills of such importance not get done on his watch. And in many respects, members on both sides, respect a member of longstanding who is retiring, and that there should be some additional goodwill to maybe cut through some of the normal partisan bickering that delays action on legislation. But we are looking at the Coast Guard bill as a potential vehicle for a variety of maritime related bills, including the Freight Act, S 3262 that was introduced in the Senate by the CST ranking member, Senator Roger Wicker. Also, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, although it's our understanding from speaking with Senate Commerce staff that there's no interest in moving the House passed measure, but they'll likely be looking to move compromise legislation that Senators Klobuchar and Thune are working on. And then we're also, probably going to see, legislation, for ship-to-shore cranes and cybersecurity mitigation also move, particularly trying to find some workaround with Buy America requirements that kind of gets to a point Lauren made earlier about zero and near zero, and also just trying to deal with the reality of not having U.S. made equipment available to try and meet the deadlines that are being set. I mean, these are just some of the realities that members are going to need to hear, and why we're going to continue to work to keep informed of what's going on, so that now we can weigh in to, again, provide the committees with the information they need.
Steve? And now we'll just yield for your questions, or did you want, Lauren, did you want us to save this until after the political, however you want to proceed?
No, let's have a couple questions now, because you are focusing on the legislative priorities. Mark Johnson first, and then I have one as well, and maybe some will come up in the chat box.
Hey, Stephen, on the Build Back Better Act, the port electrification, can you remind us how much money they were talking about originally?
Yeah, Initially, it was pretty substantial. Like I think I'm trying to remember right offhand. Andrew Sinclair, do you have that right at hand? I think it was. It's a good question, Mark.
No, I don't have the actual number that was included in that. But I believe it was north of $200 million.
Yeah, it was actually more than that. It was I want to say it was.
I thought it was about $1 billion.
Yeah, it was roughly $1 billion or so, maybe a little more than that, 1.1.
Now, on the initial version.
On the initial version,
Right.
that was the House version.
Right.
And then, the realities of moving down toward the mansion 1.7 kind of really was the last iteration. I kind of lost track of where they were.
Yeah, I think when you talk about port electrification, that is a Port Authority expenditure, which we're glad to work with our, Port Authority partners on. But I'm really kind of wondering, with the streamlined Build Back Better plan, or having multiple bills, Build Back Better, whatever includes port electrification, will it also include that other language dealing with climate? And if so, is this the area that we focus on for near zero cargo handling equipment? Or is that something better suited for some place else?
No, Mark, that's a great question, and you're right. That would be an area that we'd want to engage the Congress on that topic. And this is one where I think from the Congress's standpoint, they're going to want to understand the practicalities of, requiring, funding or MTOs to, purchase equipment or to make investments in technologies that either aren't available or readily available, because, part of their interest here is getting money out the door and to try and address, the climate priorities that they have. And this is something that, again, it's going to be interesting to see when practicality meets, the ideal of what, they're trying to accomplish with their policies. So I would say that, certainly from the appropriations standpoint and the ongoing negotiation, we'll just have to see how they decide to dispense with the Build Back Better bill, whether they try and roll it into smaller appropriations bills, whether they try to again advance certain parts of it as standalone legislation. This is all stuff that is going to have to be worked out, but it's going to have to happen in a very short time period.
There have also been some reports where Senator Wyden, on obviously on the tax writing committee in the Senate, has talked about tax credits. So, and I know that's an issue that NAWE has thought about in terms of cargo handling equipment and how to take advantage of that. So far, what I've seen in the reports is he's talking like totally electric, and a lot of it for electric vehicles and providing credits per household or individual, but also for businesses. So these things are literally being kind of rewritten and rethought with some sort of underlying themes of climate and green, and but some of it would have tax elements that would sort of, all these things are scored differently, and they're right, yeah. So anyway, I hope we've addressed your question.
Yeah, I think so. This is something obviously that as NAWE moves forward, Lauren, we have to make it an action item because it will require probably amending the bill. But I think basically as an industry, we've got a huge issue on our hands because a lot of policymakers jump immediately to the idea that zero emissions is readily available. And as mentioned earlier, that's not necessarily the case. We're talking billions of dollars at stake here. And I don't see the nation of California, as I refer to it, backing off its 2020-30 requirement. And it's right around the corner. So we need some federal leadership on the issue is what it comes down to.
Thank you, Mark. It's one of our pillars and we're working on it. Tom Saunders, you have a question?
Thanks, Lauren, and I completely agree with Mark Johnson's comments there. Having a one pager we can give to congressional staff to sort of educate them on this issue would be really good. But on the Coast Guard reauthorizations, and Dave and Stephen, you had mentioned that Congress was going to be, the House and Senate were looking to drop bills at the end of February. Have we been asked to weigh in at all on the MARAD or FMC titles, or we meaning NAWE?
Well, I mean, clearly through Lauren's leadership and yours and others, NAWE did weigh in when HR 4996 was, rapidly going through the House of Representatives. And those views were also shared with our, friends over on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation, Committee in the Senate. So I think in part, NAWE effectively weighing in while the legislation was being considered in the House, produced the outcome that we've heard is happening in the Senate now, that they want to, negotiate out their own, Senate companion bill and not simply take up the House passed, version of the Ocean, Shipping Reform Act. So that's something that, certainly, now we weighed in and it's been very helpful. I would say that we would probably continue to engage with the committees now that we know that they're drafting legislation. Certainly, we will want to know what's in an FMC title, which is, again, conventionally, included in a Coast Guard Act. And we'll also want to know how they intend to take up, the Freight Act, whether they're looking to move that as a provision on a Coast Guard Act, or whether they're looking to maybe combine the Freight Act with the Senate Ocean Shipping Reform Act to have more of like a supply chain, bill that they can move through, just because of the political sensitivity of the issue.
If I can just jump in and add, Tom, if you recall, what was contemplated, I guess initially when ocean shipping reform, the Garamendi HR, what was it? 4996. When it came up, it moved in the House under suspension in an expedited fashion that really, was pressed by several members, including Garamendi and others, and they gained a lot of co-sponsors. But that was initially contemplated by staff, meaning the staff of the and Chairman DeFazio at House T&I, as going through regular order, which would have been the Coast Guard authorization. And so there, Garamendi and others really worked outside of that process, and the fact that it was bipartisan and the pressures of the news reports and concerns about the supply chain really drove that effort to bring that kind of in an unbaked, unripe, expedited fashion that, lent itself to kind of not being well received by the Senate, which hopefully will take a more matured and measured approach with respect to any reforms in this area. But that really superseded and jumped the tracks with respect to the normal regular order process, which Dave already alluded to, and we did in our previous slides with respect to Coast Guard being the regular order process, as well as the MARAD portions in the NDAA. Those are going to be really, unless something extraordinary happens again, like was the case with the Garamendi bill, the process for that. And NAWE and we, on behalf of NAWE, have been engaged in helping provide input as, those solicitations to member offices on the committees, either T&I members or members of commerce have submitted their request. That was kind of what initially got the churn going and the dialogue back and forth with the committee staffs on both the commerce and T&I.
Thank you for that. Andrew Sinclair, your hand is up.
Thanks, Lauren and Stephen and Dave. Thank you. I apologize. I missed part of the discussion as someone walked into my office to talk about something else. So I apologize if I'm retreading ground that you've already covered. But talking about the proposed amendments to the Shipping Act, and as that's moving forward, has NAWE, I will say I am concerned that you've got ag interests and others that have a sympathetic ear in Congress that are something is going to get done in this space, right? I think that's a pretty safe comment to make. The vehicle moves on, but is maybe up in the air, but something is going to get done. And you've got the ag interests who have a sympathetic ear, and frankly, the ship lines as foreign entities, much less sympathetic with members of Congress. And the risk is that terminal operators get pinched in that space where, and the bill rolls. So what is NAWE doing to not just oppose legislation, right, where we have sincerely held concerns and real concerns, but to offer something to Congress as an alternative that they can move forward, that would perhaps be a better and preferred alternative to what has been offered to date.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'll take this one, gentlemen, if you don't mind. We're working with Jeff Vogel, our NAWE's attorney, and he's redlining it right now. I talked to him a little earlier today. He's redlining Dune Cloverture bill, and we're going back to some things that have crept back into it that we're very, very unhappy with. We're unhappy with the new language on recertification. We're very unhappy with the language on retribution and how it's got a catch-all in it. There's a provision for that in the law. We're unhappy with that as well. So there's a lot we're unhappy with. We're right with you, Andrew. We're taking this red line that we've done, just like we did with 4996. And we didn't just say trash this bill because we know that's not going to work. We said this doesn't work because, and this is what we would rather see. And we deleted a bunch of stuff. And we told them why we deleted it and why it wouldn't work. And we're doing the same thing with Dune Cloverture. And then we're going to be working with our talented here at Blank Rome and at Becker to push this on the hill and to work our bench of champions that we're developing to hopefully get our way. Mark, you had a comment?
Yeah, when does Jeff get done with his red line?
Probably by the end of the week, but everyone on the board will see it before it goes anywhere.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, absolutely. As always, I never go to the hill with anything unless the board's blessed it. Tom?
Laura, so was the bill in there dropped?
No,
No, yeah.
no, not yet.
We just.
It's not yet, but
It's a draft.
there's Ag came out with another big article today. I'll route it around. So we're just jumping on it.
So they have amended their draft.
They've amended
That's
their draft,
correct.
and Jeff's got a copy of that.
Okay.
Jeff, are you on the line? Okay. Yeah, Jeff Vogel's got a copy of it, and he's working on it. In the interest of time, gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today and your energy, and thank you for staying with us. I know you will be. And we'll move on to our last session right now with the Becker team. Omar Franco, Anthony Bedell, and Clarence Williams. I've gotten a chance to know them all. I had the pleasure of working with Anthony at USDOT when he was in the Secretary's office, getting to know Clarence and Omar much better. But you add a new element to our team. I look forward to hearing from you about political forecasting.
All right, so I guess we got the fun part, right? So this is what we're gonna do. Rather than focus, give you a bunch of slides, I'm gonna show you guys exactly where we go to get a lot of our actual information. So our preferred website is realclearpolitics.com. And Victoria, are you going to be walking us through some of those? So the first one, and we'll talk a little bit about it. Oh, you're going to go through those. Are you going to go to the website? Yeah, let's do the website first. You know, any political discussion, there's like 3 baseline numbers we always look at to find out what like you know, what the country is feeling and how they're veering. And one of the big ones has always been, you know, the president's job approval number. So if you could pull that one up. And so this is, so, you know, what this does, it gives you all the public polls. Obviously there's a lot of private ones too, but these are all the latest public polls. And then what Real Clear does is they do a really nice job here at creating a spread for you. So this is basically Vegas, right? So this is like, you know, the big game is happening, what's the date? November 8th, midterm elections, but this is what we start looking at. And this is one of the baseline things that we look at. So president job approval, right now, the average 40% approval, 55% disapproved. And so I'm going to turn it a little bit over to Anthony and Clarence, but first, you know, I want to ask Clarence, you know, obviously the president had some serious wins at the beginning of his presidency, you know, American Rescue Act, the bipartisan bill. Why do you think, you know, what do you see in those numbers, and how do you think that Biden could turn those around?
Well, certainly one of the things that I've thought from the very beginning is you can't hope with narrow margins like the president's working with to pass a piece of legislation like Build Back Better as this gargantuan piece of legislation with the price tag that it has. It should have been split up long ago and broken down to its constituent parts and moved along. Now, that's where he has an advantage potentially going in. Those numbers look like they look because of the failure of getting Build Back Better in. Yeah. Too many things that folks held important are in those bills are not happening. And so not only is his numbers going down, generally speaking, but they're going down amongst Democrats for that reason.
Yeah. And you see some trend lines there. So you see the big ones, but also, you know, when you go all the way back, it has, and I think July, August was that exact time frame, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly. And so he has some opportunities for some victories, where some, you know, some components that he can handle himself without having to go through Congress. Prescription drugs, he can handle that administratively. He can handle DACA administratively, which brings in, you know, the Latino vote that he's sorely going to need. He can handle tuition assistance and loan forgiveness himself, which gives him an opportunity to get some victories that up those numbers going into the election cycle. But certainly, like I said, this last 5 or 6 months, kind of, in my feeling, you know, kind of pitting around with a bill that was too big to pass.
Right.
You know, lost a lot of time, and consequently, his numbers are what they are.
Yeah. Anthony, what is making the president's numbers? Why are they so depressed in your opinion?
I think that since August, he's had a tough run, and a lot of these issues are now penetrating people's pocketbooks. And I always go back to President Clinton. It's the economy stupid, and it always is in every election. Normally you have some when the controlling party in the White House has a midterm, they naturally lose seats. I think that could grow given if he doesn't see over the next 10 months improvement in inflation, gas prices, supermarkets still aren't stocked. I mean, that can still impact these numbers. There's time, but they need to move now, because you can't fix inflation in a month. I mean, it needs to be fixed by the end of the summer. Otherwise, it's going to be a tough fall for it. And campaign wise, you know, I'd be interested to see what Clarence thinks about Democrats campaigning with Joe Biden if his approval is still at 40 in some of these swing states. And that's going to be an interesting dynamic. That being said, I mean, Republicans can't just go measuring the drapes in the speaker's office or anything.
That did not work well for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, they're fully, my side of the aisle is fully capable of screwing it all up too.
Yes.
So there's always that factor.
Right. Well, let's to that question. Let's move on to the next. So the next one that we always watch is the generic ballot, right? Which basically says, if the election were held today, who would you vote for? So right now, And you've seen, I mean, it is pretty tight. There's been a slight bump here, but the Democrats, there's some that they've had. So that one is a little bit closer, right? So the spread on the Biden numbers were -14. Here with the Republicans, it's plus 4.1. Monmouth being the latest one has Republicans by 8. So on the generic congressional, I mean, Clarence, the conventional wisdom, right, is that midterm elections, party in power always loses seats. The conventional wisdom was also that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So we can't always go by that. So Clarence,
and ordinarily that's been the historical precedent that we're working with. This is probably the most unique set of circumstances we've had in our country since long before any of us were born. To what we see as variables going into this election cycle. This is the last election and this election coming so far built on social issues. And I think I've always found that to be particularly interesting in Congress because really, at the end of the day, we deal with, 5% of the issues we deal with are of social impact. The rest of them are about economic moves, economic development, those types of things. The thing about a social platform is it's visceral. And because it's visceral, it's dynamic, and so you get these mood swings, nationally that happen relatively quickly, especially lately, because we're all fed up. We're all tired of being stuck indoors. We're all unhappy about this, that, and the other thing that all ties to this pandemic and some other things. If you get to April or summer and folks are outside and they're going where they want to go and they're not having to put masks on, the mood changes immediately. You're a lot less concerned about a lot of things that angered you. I also look at this a question that's really ushered in a few folks over this past few months here in Virginia and other places, conversations about CRT, things like that. Those social issues were a direct result of what we were arguing about last summer. It's a push and pull. It's always been that way in government and societally. And so those things are swinging way faster than they usually do. Because there's few policy conversations on the bottom. This is how I feel.
Right.
And so those things swing pretty.
And how I feel can't be wrong or right. It's just how I feel.
Exactly. That's how I feel. Folks have no trust in the policy conversations that they hear because there's so much misinformation out there. So this really kind of throws what we see as conventional wisdom out the window.
Right.
It's going to come down to you've got the Democrats are tripping over themselves, and fumbling the ball at every turn.
Right.
And then you've got the Republicans that are on the prevent defense. And not really a platform behind it. Well, you look last weekend and the football games, defenses didn't really work all
No.
Dudes were scoring in 13 seconds.
Correct.
So this gets pretty interesting. It comes down to, figuratively speaking, who has the ball last.
Right.
Who makes the right move, the last right move, getting into September, getting into October, getting into November, that makes that person who's about this thing not care about that thing so much.
Right.
Yeah, but your quarterback isn't Patrick Mahomes, it's Joe
Biden.
He's not swinging at 7.
Well, and I'll swing him back. So let's go to the third one. So the big one here is country sentiment. So direction of the country. So this is one we, been measured ad nauseum all the time, but we always look at this to get a trend line, right? And so here, obviously, I'm going to Anthony on this one. Like he said, the direction right now, a lot of negativity, a lot of pessimism out there. A lot of it obviously related to Omicron. But Anthony, can you give us a little bit more color commentary?
I think I agree with Clarence 100%. The lockdowns and the anger and people upset at school boards certainly played a race. A lot of in the Virginia race when Governor Youngkin won, Virginia tends to be a bellwether most of the time on how the midterm is going to go. If mandates go away and people are going on their summer, we talked about this a bit yesterday, going on their summer vacations, these indicators start to drop. I think, it becomes a level playing field in the fall, given the tight margins. But if these trends continue, I mean, if you're in the minority party, you like to see that as far as I hope you don't want to see it for the country. You want the country to do well, but politically, I mean, those are, a lot of toss up. seats that maybe weren't even on the board right now. So
So they're gonna have to, in order for the Democrats to really make a comeback, that's gonna have to flip, right? Cause
Yeah.
right now, I mean, look at that, it's red up top,
I
wrong track.
I think the Democrats need to be careful about what Build Back Better pieces they put on the floor. They need some bipartisan wins if they can get them, as opposed to trying to, jam something that a lot of people don't like, and then you wind up with these numbers. They need to be smart about what they send out to the floor, I think, and that could change all this again. It's 10 months.
Right.
It's a long time, but I mean, right now they need to, and as Stephen and David laid out, they have a tight window to do this legislation on top of a Supreme Court nomination, which is going to polarize both sides.
Right.
So you have all kinds of stuff playing over this that, even if they fix some of these things, people still might be angry. So it's going to be an interesting 6 months.
Right, so, so those are the three, like, kind of overall generic, things that we look at, because these are the numbers that's very telling, right, as to the mood of the country and where things are going. But let's get it a little bit more into the nitty gritty. Can you, please pull up the Senate map for us? So, right now, obviously, we're going to maybe, I'm gonna preview a little bit, we're gonna gloss over the House a little bit, only because redistricting is not finished. They're still working on that. So a lot of the lines, we still don't know who's going to be opposing with what. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the Senate, because right now, as you all know, 50-50. So as you can see, on the lean Dem and likely Dem side, those are all going to be safe seats. There is no question in my mind that stays in the blue column. On the red column, you do have some interesting ones. Murkowski, we all feel pretty safe. Alabama open, but that's going to be very likely GOP. So really, we got a little bit tighter races. Ohio's going to be open, and Missouri's going to be open. So Clarence or Anthony, jump in. Candidates matter, right?
Even in this environment, I am not bullish on the Senate. That's a tough map for Republicans. Even in this environment, because you still have to win seats that we normally don't win. And I'm not there yet on the Senate. I think some of those toss-ups and the open seats lean GOP could change given the nominee, particularly in Ohio.
Right.
I think as we get closer into summer, this map's going to significantly change based on the mood.
Yeah, I agree. The ones to watch on this map, I would look at Ohio open, like we've talked about before, candidates matter. So that's going to be an important one. The other ones, I would still put Kelly and Hassan and Cortez Masto on the blue column. So really, I mean, again, all eyes on Georgia. Clarence, can you tell me a little bit more about that Georgia race?
Despite my love of all of my fellow Bulldogs.
Yes.
And in keeping with the fact that we just won a national championship.
And for full disclosure, this man actually played for the football.
So my backfield mates across the generations being what they are. That race, I honestly don't see washing out in Mr. Walker's favor. I think there are a couple of things that are going to be hurtful for him going in, not the least of which is you've got probably the best get out the vote person on the Democrat side in the country, in the backyard. And when I talked earlier about the push and pull, you've got this huge, result stemming from the elections, whether you believe there was a steal or not, but still that these states are going and enacting these voting laws that are very restrictive. Well, the pull to that is you start cropping up, and we're starting to see it now in the last few weeks. These organizations are very seriously about getting folks, either registered to vote, getting around all the morass to getting themselves ready to vote. Georgia is going to be the epicenter of that because they've got someone who does it increasingly well. And when you put the fear in folks that, okay, if you get through this election, you're gonna do the right thing, you are no longer going to be a part of this process. I don't think anyone is able to get themselves heard more than the established folks in Georgia. So I think for that reason and that reason alone, You know, Herschel has an uphill battle against Warnock. Warnock has stayed pretty quiet. He's not doing anything to annoy anyone, you know, saying anything stupid that's gonna get him, you know, Twitterfied. And so, you know, a lot of it again comes back to a lot of things we talked about. If the administration can at least not continue to shoot and kill itself.
Yeah.
You know, the first mantra of war is don't kill yourself.
Right.
Friendly
fire,
avoid friendly fire. Yeah. You know, if they can get to October, November, you know, October and not have done any more damage, then I think Warnock
Squeezes it out.
through.
And by the way, Victoria, if you could just hit that, the Georgia race, you can always on any, or you can hit the state. You can go in and it will give you the latest polls for any of the states.
I mean, up here.
Yeah, you did it. Yeah, so right now, not a whole lot of public information on that. You know, as you can see, +1, that's well within the margin of error. 49, 48, that's a tie right now. So you know, and again, that was a different a recent one, Quinnipiac. So you know, that's when we look at. But just know that if you're looking at any individual race, you can just kind of click on the map and you can kind of get the latest polls and get a feel for where that race is going. Pennsylvania.
I would just add, candidates matter. I don't know anything about the skills of Herschel Walker, a great football player, but Warnock just went through a rough special election and survived and won, so he's been tested. And you said he's been very smart in his messaging. We don't know how Herschel Walker is going to campaign in the next 10 months. And if he has one, error, it's going to be magnified 100 times because Georgia is the epicenter for the Senate elections.
Right.
An untested candidate sometimes works and sometimes it blows up. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, celebrity candidates. I mean, we can go on and on about those, but that's a different conversation. That would take another half hour. But the other race I would look at is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, Dr. Oz, ton of money. 3 straw polls got 1 vote, in the straw polls. So not a lot of grassroots movement. David McCormick got there. So, is he going to follow the Glenn Youngkin playbook? Just throw a ton of money, get a good team, say the right things, drum up the social issues. So,
I mean, talk about Arizona Governor Youngkin caught tiger by the tail with the school board fight. And I mean, that race was trending off differently. And suddenly it switched on a dime. Then, not a lot of polling because the candidates still, as you can see up top, they don't even have McCormick up there yet. So still a lot of uncertainty there. And then you're gonna have a tough Democratic primary in that.
Yeah.
Too.
Absolutely. Connor Lamb right now, I would say is probably in the lead right now. Wait, what is it? Oh, Oz. That's an interesting one. Oz +11, that's an interesting poll. I would say
probably paid for it.
I would say Dr. Oz probably paid for that poll. So I'm a betting man.
Do you like Dr. Oz or state?
Right. So the last one that we're going to look at is the governor's races. So Victoria, if you can. Governor's races, so that's the map right now. As you can see, lots of governor's races. Republicans seem to have a lock in 25, Democrats in 18, 7 are up for toss-ups. Kemp is going to have, again, Georgia, really tough reelect. Purdue's going to be in the primary. Pennsylvania, you're double dipping when you have the governor and the Senate race up and they're both open seats. Arizona open is going to be an interesting one as well. Whitmer, as bad as she was at the beginning of the pandemic in Michigan, she's had to deal with the Republican legislature, so she's really come around. And I think, I think she holds on by a slim margin. Nevada, the same. So I think, those are all going to go to their party. So right now, as we're seeing, a lot of 50-50 split. So these are the things we look at. Unfortunately, I would get into the House. And like I said, on the House, 5 votes, that's all it takes, and 5 seats, is all it's going to take. to flip. So, McCarthy, I can tell you, is very bullish. The House leadership is. Pelosi, I mean, they keep on the other side, the DCCC keeps on putting more and more people on the I have to defend list, So, but as it gets closer, there will be a House map as well, and you can look at House races do not get as many polls out there. That's why it's kind of a little bit trickier. If you have any questions on any individual House races, please feel free to contact us or Lauren or anybody on the team. We can probably give you some, color commentary. We know the ones that are kind of traditionally have, are kind of what we call, revolver seats versus revolving door seats versus, steady seats. I do think there's probably going to be anywhere between 40 to 60 House seats in play. So it will be an interesting, I think the Democrats have 30 resignations. Cooper resigned yesterday. I don't know if they're up to 29, 30. So they're either at 29 or 30, where the House, where the Republicans, I thought last time I saw was a dozen. So retirements is also a sign as to, especially if it's coming from the party currently in power, it's also a sign of their sentiment and their mood, like, do I want to really go through a tough in a volatile year?
Last time I saw that list, there was very safe blue seats though. That was
very absolutely.
Except for Cooper's. Now Cooper, they rejiggered that seat where it lost something like 19%.
The bulk of them were going to be in pretty safe seats.
Yeah,
for the Democrats.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be.
So I know I have like 5 minutes left here or so. So like if there's any questions or if anybody has anything, but I just wanted to give you guys a tool that you all could look at, real clear politics. I will tell you, every K Street person I know, that's what we look at. That will give us, especially when it comes closer to the House races, that's what gives us, a little color as to what's going on in some of these races and look at polls if there's anything public out there. So this is our first line of defense or offense, whatever you want to call it. This is where we look at and we try to, kind of steer our.
It's definitely the most balanced and gives you the most information.
100.
You can choose, what you want to do with that information. That gives you a pretty fair shot of what's going on in the electorate at that time.
Yeah.
What seats are on or off list and et cetera. Other than you see on, polls on CNN or Fox or whatever. This shows everybody's polls. Then you can pick and choose which polls you like and what you're not seeing. You pick up more information as they go, and it's a pretty fair website.
Yep. So Lauren, if anybody has questions.
Thank you very much. The camaraderie in your office is evident. Thank you so much.
I don't like either of these guys.
I haven't seen these guys in like 18 months.
Well, I'm in the middle, keeping them apart. That's why it's working right now. So.
That's funny. Every week, I'm very, very privileged to have a phone call with the team from Becker and the team from Blank Rome, and all of us work together as a team. And it's just been an amazing experience. I learn from them every single week. And I know that I could never keep up with all the information that they keep up with. For those of my generation, it's the plate spinners on the old Ed Sullivan show. It's the jugglers. It's they just know where everything is and catch it before it falls. Do we have questions?
I don't know if that's good or bad.
Questions? It's good. It's good. Not as good as Jimmy Buffett, but it's good.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a Buffett fan. Questions for Mark Johnson, question.
Yeah, I don't have a question on polls or races or anything like that. But I'm interested in what Becker has to say, as well as Blank Rome. There haven't been a lot of victories that this administration can point to. I'm concerned about how they react to the supply chain. Specifically, picture says 1,000 words. The pirates on the railroad in LA, bad optics, man, bad. You've got a White House port czar or whatever we want to call them, that's looking at the supply chain. And we in the business know there's no easy solution when it comes to congestion. There's no light switch that you're going to be able to turn on and off that in about a month will clear up these ports. There just isn't. So I'm curious about your views on, given the fact that the administrations has to be looking for a victory to change the optics before the midterm elections, whether or not they try to zero in on the supply chain and try to legislate solutions. What concerns me here is whenever you try to legislate operations, it's a real bad idea. I mean, you just create more inefficiency. But yeah, I'm just curious about what your thoughts are here. The other thing that concerns me about supply chain is data standards. Lauren, this is something we can talk about later on. But the idea of trying to legislate like port metrics, data standards inside a terminal, that's got me a little concerned.
Yeah, I wish we will all be on alert for legislation. I mean, the Garamendi bill is an example. They just, shot that thing through the House, and we didn't even have a chance to comment until it was already kind of baked. And we need to be aware of having too fast legislative solutions that do long-term significant harm.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Right. No, Mark, and I mean, you raise a good point, and unfortunately, the mindset, for a lot of members of Congress is let no emergency go wasted, and it does provide an opportunity for ideas to, somehow be raised and be taken hold that can produce unexpected outcomes. Because Congress is acting, more on the political necessity as opposed to, with full information of the implications of its policy changes. And that's why I just think, the strategy that's been adopted to have NAWE members go up and to build and culture relationships with champions on the Hill is so important, because there are a lot of members who are relatively new to Congress. The churn is only going to probably be accelerated in the 2022 midterms.
Yeah.
And, the shipping industry or ocean transportation is very, very complicated. And to expect members to be able to address or understand the nuance of policy affecting that industry, it's just naive, especially when you consider that they have to literally take up any issue sun on any given day. So we really do need to build a cadre of champions who can be the guardrails from having Congress act imprudently to expedite moving legislation without really understanding what they're doing. And it's only going to be more important when you have someone like a Chairman DeFazio retiring, who really has been around and understands transportation policy. So just a note of caution.
So I will say there is a little bit of good news. So for one of my clients, and Lauren knows this because I looped you guys in, we started poking around as to there was a congressional supply chain caucus started. And after the whole January 6th debacle, it kind of just went dormant. So about 3 months ago, we started asking, hey, what are you guys doing? I mean, what's going on? It was Congressman Rouser, Davis, Craig, and Allred. And there was no answer. They really had just shut it down. So at our insistence and at our kind of nudging, they have relaunched the Supply Chain Caucus as of this week. I am actively soliciting members to join, members who would be friendly to our cause, to join the Supply Chain Caucus. So if we're going to start looking for bipartisan solutions, getting them gymmed up, and for us to be, front and center there so that we're able to really help the caucus, maybe help them do briefings. This would be a rank and file type of organization, so it would be apart from leadership. So just know that with this caucus coming on board, and if we need, and we'll do our part to make it a very good caucus and an active caucus, like that, we'll have a strong voice, and then we'll have a bench of advocates that we can turn to. So just know that that is something that we've proactively done for you all, that we think could be a real game changer, not just for this session, but also in the future.
And I'll just add one little quick thing to the original question. Typically, the playbook would say on a convoluted issue like this, when you throw it back to the legislature, if you're the president, and you let them come up with something and work it through. But you know, as Dave mentioned, this is kind of an emergency situation that you leave. And it comes back to the conversation we we're having earlier about, well, this may come down to who has the ball last. I think the president sits on this whole thing until he has no other choice but to do something getting into the summer. He would rather the legislature handle something like this. There may not be the time or the ability to do that. So if you're going to put something out that is likely to have problems, you do it close to the elections and worry about it on the other side. But to Omar's point, this is an opportunity for us because everybody's looking for ideas. And who better to ask for those ideas but the folks who deal with this every day. This is a chance not only for us to work with the legislature, but the administration. At some point, they've got to address this administratively if Congress can't get their head around it. And so that provides opportunities for us for sure.
And Lauren, just one final comment. That I just want to pick up on what he just said. That's one of the reasons why we added language to the Wall Street Journal op-ed. I mean, we're offering solutions, you know, versus just stating a problem.
Yeah.
And Mark, people are noticing that now he's doing that. It's making a real difference. I hate to do this. We've got to draw this to a close. In the interest of time, we promised you 2 hours. We've gone just a bit over, but I think it's well worth it. I want to thank Paul, Walter, Stephen, Dave, Omar, Clarence, and Anthony for all of the wisdom that you shared with us today, for your insights, for the energy putting your presentations together. On behalf of NAWE, you will each be receiving handmade chocolates from Kingsbury Chocolates. Our friend Rob Kingsbury owns the company, and they're just, they're wonderful and they're hard to find. So we'll be sending those out to you today. It'll be in the
Our wives
shape of the
appreciate
Capitol.
I'm not sure.
My kids.
Yes, it's in the shape of the Capitol, so you can take a bite out of Washington, okay? And yeah, thank you so much for everyone on the call. Thank you for staying with us today. This has been great. Our next event starts March 7th, and it'll be the grants webinar, and I know you'll get notifications about it. Thank you for being part of NAWE. Heather, Victoria, thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Well done.
You know.
Yay, good job.